Welcome to tonight's sleep story. Let's drift into a soothing story together as you begin your journey into a restful and rejuvenating sleep. Imagine walking through a small medieval village, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. In the homes, food preparation is sparse, with little variety or flavor. A typical meal consists of whatever could be scraped together from the hard, unforgiving soil. Bread, dense and coarse, made from rye or barley, is the staple for the common folk. But this bread is often stale, dry, and nearly impossible to chew. It's not the warm, soft loaf you might imagine from modern bakeries, but a tough, gritty substance that barely satisfies the hunger pangs, let alone nourishes the body. For the poor, the idea of a balanced meal is almost foreign. The bread, which fills the bulk of the diet, is often paired with watery broths, or, if there's a stroke of luck, a few scraps of meat or cheese, but meat is rare. It's too expensive and too valuable for the peasants to afford. On occasion, they might have access to some salted fish or game if they're able to catch it or trade for it, but this too is rare, and even then it's preserved poorly, often making it tasteless and tough. In the bleakness of the season, the food is often little more than survival dot. The villagers can make do with the meager food they have, but it is far from ideal. The diet lacks essential vitamins and nutrients, leading to widespread malnutrition. Even in a time of abundance, the idea of flavor was almost non-existent to the peasant. Without spices reserved for the wealthy, food is bland, flavored only by the few herbs they could cultivate or gather from the wild. What might seem like a simple, unseasoned vegetable stew to a modern person was often the pinnacle of their meals. A dish made from whatever grew, and often not enough to stave off hunger for long dot in the homes of the wealthier. However, food tells a different story. At the Lord's table, there is an abundance, meats, breads, and fruits, all carefully prepared and seasoned with imported spices. The nobles have access to fresh fish, delicacies from distant lands, and the finest cuts of meat. The disparity between the two is glaring. While the Lord and his family dine on roasted game, honeyed pastries, and rich stews, the peasants eat a fraction of that, left to scrape by on what little the earth provides the noble classes access to luxury foods is a reminder of the vast gap between the two worlds, the one full of abundance, the other struggling in perpetual scarcity. While peasants eat to survive, the nobles feast for pleasure. The rich, with their access to trade routes and well-stocked kitchens, are nourished in ways that the poor will never know. And this stark contrast is felt deeply by the villagers, who are trapped in a world where food is not a symbol of luxury, but a daily battle for survival. In the heart of medieval life, food was a precious commodity. For peasants, each meal was a small victory, a fragile hope that they could make it through another day. The land they worked was unpredictable, sometimes barren, sometimes bountiful, but even in the best of times, they had little to work with. The harsh realities of medieval agriculture made food production a constant struggle. The soil often struggled to yield anything substantial, and even when it did, the food grown was far from adequate in terms of nutrition. The grain that was harvested was often turned into coarse bread, and nothing went to waste. The husks and the worst parts, of the grains were sifted and ground into flour, making the bread thick and dry, difficult to chew. This bread, a constant companion, was rarely fresh and often became stale before it could be consumed. It was a far cry from the soft loaves we take for granted today. The bread was dense, its texture gritty, as if it were built not to please the palate, but to fill the stomach. For a peasant, a loaf of bread was not a treat, but a necessity, a mere vehicle to carry whatever little nourishment could be scraped from the rest of their meal. A typical meal might consist of this dry bread, some water boiled with herbs, and, if the peasants were lucky, a few small vegetables, onions, leeks, cabbage, or whatever could be gathered from the garden. But these meals were far from balanced. They lacked proteins and essential vitamins. The meat that could be eaten was rare, reserved mostly for special occasions or for the wealthier nobility. Salted pork or whatever game could be hunted was a luxury few could afford. Even then, the quality of the meat was questionable. Often it had been preserved in the salt so long that it became almost inedible, tough and unpleasant to the taste. Fish, though somewhat more accessible, was often dried or salted to make it last, losing its flavor and texture in the process. The peasants also lacked the richness of spices. These were rare and expensive, saved only for the wealthier classes. The food that the peasants consumed was almost always bland, without the luxury of herbs like cinnamon, cloves, or even simple salt for seasoning. Their meals lacked any depth of flavor. Instead, they relied on the few local herbs that could be grown in small garden plots, garlic, parsley, and thyme, just enough to mask the dullness of their food. These herbs were important not only for flavor, but for medicinal purposes as, well, many peasants were often ill, weakened by malnutrition or exposure to the harsh conditions of their lives, and these herbs provided some relief. However, they were no substitute for a truly balanced diet, which the peasants could never afford. For those living in towns, the situation was only slightly better. While the village had limited access to meat, vegetables, and grains, townspeople could access more variety in their food. Bakers often made fresh bread daily, and the town market offered seasonal vegetables. However, like the peasants, they too relied on basic ingredients. Meat was still a luxury, and while the wealthy townsfolk could afford more exotic foods, they were still limited by the same seasonal cycles as the rural population. Bread, vegetables, and occasionally fish were staples, and they too struggled with scarcity when food was unavailable. During winter months, even the markets could offer little more than salted fish, dried meats, and root vegetables dot as the peasants worked the fields. Their survival was tied directly to the whims of nature. A poor harvest could mean hunger and, often, illness. Starvation was a constant fear that loomed over the village, and famine could strike without warning, leaving entire populations at risk. The land could yield only so much too much rain, or not enough could ruin crops. Even if the harvest was decent, there was always the looming threat of pests or disease that could destroy crops and render them useless. The noble class, on the other hand, lived an entirely different life. They ate well, their tables covered with meats, fruits, and cheeses, foods that the peasants could only dream of. The wealthy had kitchens stocked with fine spices, imported from distant lands, and access to the finest grains, meats, and delicacies. Their food was often prepared by professional cooks, seasoned with the finest imported spices and accompanied by wine, fruits, and vegetables that were fresh and carefully cultivated. For the rich, food was not just sustenance, but an experience, a lavish display of wealth. In contrast, for the peasants, food was a matter of survival, in moments of feast, such as when a lord's banquet was held. The wealth of the meal was a stark reminder of the imbalance that existed between the classes. The peasants, with their meager meals of stale bread and watery stews, could only long for the rich food of the nobility, but these luxuries were never theirs to claim. The noble's life, with its abundance and luxury, seemed like a different world, a world where food was a pleasure and a privilege, while for the peasant, food was simply a tool to survive. The daily meals of medieval peasants were not defined by pleasure, but by necessity. The food they ate, although essential, was often unappetizing and nutritionally inadequate. Every bite was a reminder of the scarcity that permeated their lives. Breakfast, if it could even be called that, might consist of a stale hunk of bread, dipped in water or leftover broth from the previous night's meal. There were no luxuries like eggs, fresh fruits, or milk. Those were for the rich, not for the peasants. What little dairy was available often came in the form of sour, thin milk or hard, dry cheese, which was barely enough to provide nourishment and lacked any of the richness we associate with dairy today. The taste of the cheese was sharp, bitter, in places and crumbly, often tough enough to require soaking in a bit of water to soften it. Lunch was little better. If it could even be called a meal, it was often just a repeat of whatever bread was left over, slathered with some remnants of meat or scraps from the previous evening. Some peasants might be able to gather wild herbs, mushrooms, or berries, but these were a rarity and only available in the warmer months. If the season was right and the land had been generous, they might have a simple vegetable stew. But even then, the vegetables were tough, and the broth was so thin that it barely offered any flavor, let alone the nutrients needed for a full meal. The stew might have been flavored with whatever herbs were available, perhaps a few onions, some garlic, or a handful of dried nettles, but these were used sparingly as they were expensive to acquire. The scarcity of meat was the greatest hardship for medieval peasants. If they were lucky enough to have some meat, it would usually come in the form of tough cuts or salted leftovers, often from animals that had outlived their usefulness as work. Animals. The taste of this salted meat could be overwhelmingly harsh, and even when cooked, it remained tough and unappetizing. For many peasants, the concept of fresh meat was almost an abstraction. Even hunting, once a skill taught to young men, was reserved for the rich who had hunting grounds, laws that protected their exclusive rights, and the means to afford proper game. For the peasants, hunting was not only difficult but also dangerous, as poaching could lead to severe punishments, sometimes even execution. Fish, a possible exception to this scarcity, was often salted, dried, or smoked for preservation. However, it lacked the freshness we might expect from a modern fish market. The flavor of preserved fish was overpowering and pungent, with little of the delicate taste of fresh fish left behind. For a long time, the poorer members of society would eat whatever could be gathered, from scraps of animals discarded by wealthier families to even the bones of fish. It was an endless battle for nourishment, and what little sustenance was provided could only sustain them for so long before the gnawing hunger would return. And then there was the water. Clean, drinkable water was a luxury, a privilege reserved for the wealthier families who lived close to the springs or wells that provided fresh water. The peasants, however, often drank from rivers, ponds, or communal wells, which were far from sanitary. Water could be contaminated with bacteria or waste, leading to frequent illnesses. The health of the community was constantly at risk, and foodborne illnesses were common. The risk of disease was ever present, as the villagers had little understanding of hygiene or food safety. Much of the water was consumed without boiling it, and food preparation lacked the sanitation standards we take for granted today. In this environment, even the simplest meals carried the potential for harm. Yet, despite these overwhelming odds, the peasants continued to make do, finding solace in the steady, unyielding rhythm of their daily life. There was little choice but to continue working the land, harvesting whatever could be grown, and stretching their food as far as possible. The cyclical nature of the seasons allowed for some respite. Harvests would come, though not always enough, and the lean months could often be survived with clever methods of food storage and preservation. Root vegetables could be kept through the winter, dried meats were salted to last, and grains were stored in the hope that the next planting season would be more generous. At times, though, there would be famine, a persistent shadow that loomed over the peasants. Whether caused by bad weather, crop failures, or overhunting by the rich, famine could strike at any time. The consequences were dire, often resulting in death from starvation or malnutrition. The rich, insulated from such hardship, would not understand the depth of suffering that the peasants endured. While they feasted on delicacies, the peasants struggled to make do with whatever scraps of food they could scrape together. In the face of this hardship, the peasants' food was not a source of joy, but rather a mark of survival. Each meager bite was part of a much larger effort, a quiet, unspoken determination to live, to endure, and to pass down the legacy of resilience from one generation to the next. They did not live to feast, but to survive, and in this struggle, they found a sense of pride. The food, however scarce or unpalatable, was a reminder of their strength and perseverance. In medieval times, even food preparation was a laborious, meticulous process, one that took much more than just the cook's skill. It required the patient accumulation of resources, knowledge, and the ability to stretch every scrap to its fullest potential. For the peasants, food was never about indulgence. It was about making the most of what was available, often turning what would be discarded elsewhere into a meal that could sustain a family for another day. The preparation of meals, though simple, was an art in itself. The long hours spent in the kitchen were marked by the rhythmic chopping of vegetables, the careful grinding of grain, and the constant stirring of stews and broths over the fire. These were the sounds of survival, the sounds that filled the air of every cottage, as each meal was a reminder of the effort it took to turn mere ingredients into something nourishing. The fire was the heart of every medieval home. the constant presence around which all activity revolved. Cooking over an open flame was not just a method, but a necessity. The fire, though essential for warmth in cooking, was unpredictable. It was easy for the fire to go out or to become too hot, burning the food before it could be properly prepared. Yet without the fire, there was no food, only raw, inedible ingredients. For the peasants, food preparation was not just about cooking. It was about managing the fire, ensuring it stayed at the right temperature for baking bread, roasting meat, or simmering stews. The bread, though difficult to make, was always the centerpiece of the meal. Often, it was the only food that was present at every meal, and the effort to bake it was considerable. The flour, often coarse and unrefined, was mixed with water, salt, and sometimes yeast or sourdough starter. The dough was kneaded by hand, the process slow and exhausting, but the payoff was always worth it. Once baked, the bread was hard, thick, and dense, never soft, always more like a weapon than a food source. It could be dipped in broth or broken into chunks and eaten with whatever stew or thin soup was prepared. For peasants, bread was the staple of every meal, often eaten with whatever meager leftovers could be gathered. If there was no meat, there was always bread. If the vegetables had spoiled, there was still bread. The villagers did not choose bread as their primary food. They had no choice. It was what sustained them, plain and simple. The lack of spices made flavor a foreign concept to many. There was no fragrant cinnamon or nutmeg to sprinkle on porridge, no cloves to enhance the taste of meats, and certainly no sugar to sweeten desserts. If any spices were used, they were local herbs, parsley, thyme, sage, and occasionally garlic, adding the faintest trace of flavor to an otherwise bland and flavorless meal. Salt was a rarity, used more for preserving food than for seasoning, though a pinch of salt could sometimes find its way into stews. These herbs, though important for both flavor and medicinal purposes, could not mask the basic, unchanging nature of peasant meals. The people worked with what they had. There was no room for excess, no opportunity to indulge in rich, flavorful meals. The notion of enjoying food for its taste or luxury was foreign dot as the seasons shifted. So too did the food. Winter posed an even greater challenge. With little fresh produce available, the peasants relied heavily on what had been preserved from the harvest months earlier. Dried meats, salted fish, pickled vegetables, and root vegetables were the cornerstone of winter meals. When the fresh crops were gone, only the preserved remnants of the harvest remained, often eaten in combination to create hearty but simple stews. The vegetables were stored, dried, or pickled, and their flavor diminished over time, leaving them bland and less appetizing. Yet these foods were necessary to survive the cold months when fresh supplies would be nowhere to be found. In addition to this, the preservation of food was no small feat. For the peasants, preserving food was an art they had mastered over generations. They salted, dried, pickled, and fermented everything they could. It was laborious work, but it was necessary. Salted meat could last for months, and dried fruits and vegetables could be stored and rehydrated for use during the winter months. The technique of fermenting, turning milk into sour cheese or vegetables into sauerkraut, was an essential part of their preservation efforts. Without this knowledge, Without these long-established practices, the village could not have survived the winter months. This preservation wasn't just about saving food. It was about survival. It was a quiet effort, done with steady hands and worn faces. Every piece of food that was preserved, representing an investment in tomorrow's survival. There was no luxury in this. It wasn't about enjoying the fruits of the labor, but about securing enough to get through the harsher months. Preservation was a ritual passed down over generations, ensuring that the work done in the spring, summer, and fall would not be lost come winter. It was a form of life insurance, a necessary safeguard against the unpredictability of nature. And yet, even in the midst of scarcity, there was an enduring sense of pride. The peasants took great care in their meals, turning what little they had into something useful, something sustaining. They were masters at making do, at stretching every bit of food to its fullest potential. In every piece of bread, in every stew, in every preserved vegetable, there was a reflection of the resilience and ingenuity that defined their existence. Food, though sparse and often lacking in flavor, was more than just sustenance. It was a symbol of survival, of enduring the hardships of life in a world where every day was a battle for enough. The medieval diet was not just a struggle of scarcity, it was a fight against hunger itself taught in the villages. Food was not something that was enjoyed for its flavor or abundance. It was simply a means to an end survival. The average peasant had little concept of luxury when it came to food. To them, food was defined by how little of it they could make last, not by how much they could indulge in. Each meal was a delicate balancing act, a puzzle of what could be scavenged or preserved, often made from scraps and leftovers, seasoned only with the faintest of herbs. But as the months passed and the cold weather crept closer, food became even more precious. What had been harvested in spring and summer needed to last through the long, harsh winter months. When winter set in, the reality of scarcity grew even more acute. Fresh vegetables, fruits, and grains that were abundant during the warmer months became distant memories. The once green fields turned to barren land, the promise of future harvest temporarily forgotten under a blanket of snow. The humble potato or turnip, when it could be found, became a lifeline, but even these were only available in limited quantities. Food preservation methods, though vital, had their limits. The salted meat that hung from the rafters of cottages was often tough, dry, and hard to chew. Even the fresh fish that had been salted for months no longer held any semblance of its original flavor, and what little fat remained in the meat was now considered a rare luxury. Meat was, in fact, a luxury few could afford. For the most part, peasants could only dream of feasts where roasted birds or wild game appeared in abundance. Instead, they were forced to make do with the tough, salted cuts of meat from animals that were no longer useful for work. Every part of the animal was utilized to the fullest. Nothing was wasted. The bones were boiled for broth, the fat rendered into lard for cooking, and even the organs, which would seem unappetizing to most, were cooked into pies, sausages, or used as fillings in stews. What little meat could be found was consumed with caution, stretched across several meals to ensure it didn't run out too quickly. It was not uncommon for medieval peasants to go entire days without eating a proper meal. Hunger, though always present, was a persistent companion, and the worry of running out of food was a constant anxiety. Children, often unable to understand the gravity of the situation, could only look up to their parents for answers when the food ran low. There were few things more devastating than an empty cupboard, and even fewer more powerful than the moment when hope felt as scarce as the food on the table. For those who lived in the colder, northern parts of Europe, the struggle for food was even harsher. Snow covered the ground for months at a time, and the lack of sunlight meant that crops didn't grow as quickly. The small amount of land that was cultivated could barely yield enough to feed the population, and for many, the cold meant that food from southern regions, if it arrived at all, was prohibitively expensive. The famine that struck with such frequency in medieval Europe only made the problem worse. Starvation wasn't just a possibility, it was a reality that many faced each year. When a bad harvest occurred, when the rains failed to fall at the right time, or when the soil refused to yield its bounty, the villagers could find themselves without enough to eat. The effect of a poor harvest was felt acutely. It wasn't just about fewer meals, it was about survival. The very life of the village was at risk. Meanwhile, the nobility, though never immune to such dangers, lived a starkly different reality. They had access to better food meat from well-fed livestock, spices from far-off lands, and vegetables cultivated in well-maintained gardens. These luxuries were the result of their wealth, of their control over the land and the peasants who worked it. For them, the food was not just a means of survival, but a symbol of power and privilege. They dined on rich stews, roasted meats, freshly baked bread, and fine wines. The feast tables in their great halls were filled with game birds, venison, and other expensive delicacies that the peasants could scarcely imagine. And, of course, the spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves were used liberally to add flavor to the meals, transforming even the most basic dishes into sumptuous feasts. Peasants, by contrast, were left with the scraps, the tough cuts of meat, the stale bread, and the remnants of the harvest. They were often forced to rely on what could be hunted or scavenged, turning to wild animals, nuts, and roots to make up the gaps. The gap between the rich and the poor, not just in wealth but in food, was not just a matter of luxury, but of survival. The noble's table, heaping with fresh food and rich spices, served as a constant reminder of the inequality that permeated society. The peasants, working long hours in the fields, could never afford the abundance that the rich enjoyed. They ate what they could grow, what they could preserve, and what they could afford, but always with the looming threat of hunger just around the corner dot as autumn turned to winter. The villagers faced a different kind of fear, one that would settle deep in their stomachs. The food they had harvested, the food they had preserved, was often all they had to survive. And in the long, cold months of winter, when fresh food was a distant memory, they would ration their supplies carefully, hoping that their stores would last. The threat of famine was never far, and the survival of the village often depended on how well the food had been stored. The ability to stretch a meal to make it last just a little longer was a skill that the peasants had honed over generations. The work of preserving food, of saving every scrap, became as important as the labor spent gathering it in the first place. and every meal was a victory, a reminder that despite the hardships, they had made it through another day. The contrast between the wealth of the nobility and the scarcity faced by peasants was never more stark than when it came to food. As the winter months drew closer, the food that the villagers had worked so hard to store and preserve began to take on greater importance. The early fall harvest had provided the last fresh crops, and the salt-cured meats, dried fish, and pickled vegetables were all that remained for the long, cold months ahead. Every meal was now meticulously planned, portions measured out to ensure that nothing was wasted and that the supplies could stretch as far as possible. The rhythm of life was dictated by the food available, and in times of scarcity, every morsel of bread, every thin slice of salted meat, was a reminder of the hardship that defined the peasant's life. In contrast, the noble families remained untouched by the hardships of the seasons. Their lives were full of the luxury that came with wealth, and their tables reflected this opulence. Where peasants saw the bleakness of winter approaching, nobles saw it as nothing more than an opportunity to indulge. Their pantries overflowed with delicacies, fresh meats, fruits from distant lands, and a wealth of spices and herbs that were out of reach for the common folk. Nobles enjoyed freshly roasted game, fish that was delicately prepared, and sweets, spiced with cinnamon, nutmeg, and sugar. Their abundance was not just a matter of surplus, it was a symbol of their power, of the disparity between those who had and those who had little. The peasants, even when they could obtain meat, often had to make do with less desirable cut stuff, salted or preserved. The meat they did have was from animals that were no longer useful for work or reproduction, and it often had to be eaten in small amounts to make it last. Even when they were lucky enough to have a fresh kill, perhaps from a small hunt or a gift from the local lord, they knew better than to indulge. Such meat was a rare treat, often shared among neighbors, as there was always the knowledge that their next meal might be far less generous. The vegetables, too, were sparse and unspectacular. A rich, vibrant salad made with fresh greens was a luxury known only to the wealthy. For peasants, their vegetables were root crops, potatoes, turnips, onions, and cabbage that could be stored over the winter. But these vegetables lacked the variety and taste of those enjoyed by the nobles. Even herbs, which could have added flavor and variety to their meals, were hard to come by and were often used only for medicinal purposes. The food of the peasants was based on what they could grow themselves or gather from the land, but this was rarely enough. The absence of fresh produce in winter meant that the peasants often relied on preserved or dried foods, many of which lacked taste and nutrition. Yet, despite the disparity, the peasants learned to make the best of what they had. The simple, harsh reality of their food culture gave them a deep understanding of resourcefulness. Every scrap was used, every part of an animal was consumed, and nothing went to waste. Bones from meat were boiled to make broth. Leftover bread was used too. Thickened stews and scraps of vegetables were turned into soups. Even the wild foods they gathered, mushrooms, nuts, berries, and herbs, were carefully preserved or dried for the months ahead. Every effort was made to ensure that no part of the harvest was lost, as food could not be taken for granted. For the peasants, Food preservation was not merely a way of ensuring that they had enough to eat, it was an essential part of their survival. In the fall, they would gather herbs to dry and store. They would salt meats to extend their shelf life, and they would preserve fruits and vegetables through pickling and fermentation. Cabbage could be turned into sauerkraut, fruits could be dried for later use, and grains could be stored in sacks to ensure they were available when the weather made fresh crops impossible. This process of preservation was done with the utmost care if any food was left unpreserved or spoiled. It can mean the difference between survival and starvation during the cold winter months. The rich, meanwhile, were not burdened by such worries. Their access to fresh food, stored in cool cellars or preserved in elegant glass jars, meant that they did not have to concern themselves with the same struggles. They did not have to salt their meat or preserve it in barrels. It was simply purchased, brought in from distant markets, where the finest foods were available at their fingertips. The nobles' kitchens were stocked with a variety of ingredients, from delicate fruits to tender meats, from spices that could transform the simplest dish into something extraordinary to wines that flowed freely during feasts. There was no need to preserve food for the future when you could buy what you needed at any time. Even the method of eating was different. While peasants sat together around simple wooden tables, their hands stained with the earth, the nobles dined in grand halls, seated on plush cushions, surrounded by servants who cut their meat, poured their wine, and ensured that their meals were always plentiful. Meals for peasants were quick, necessary to replenish energy for the work of the day, but for the nobles, food was an event. It was about enjoyment, about indulgence. Each bite was meant to be savored, not rushed, and meals were opportunities for conversation, for show, and for displaying wealth. This contrast, the disparity between what the poor ate and what the rich indulged in, was stark, but it was a reality that peasants lived with every day. While the wealthy feasted on the finest foods, the peasants were left to stretch the meager ingredients they had, transforming whatever they could into sustenance. The gap between the two was a reminder of the inequality that defined medieval society. The rich could afford abundance, while the poor could only hope to make it through another day. For the peasants, food scarcity was a constant burden, and the need to preserve what little they had for the future was an ongoing, never-ending task. As the months passed, and the fall harvest began to fade into the cold grip of winter, the villagers turned inward, retreating to their homes to weather the coming months. The simple yet essential task of preserving food had become an almost sacred ritual. Without the luxury of refrigeration or modern preservation techniques, everything that had been harvested had to be stored and preserved by hand. The rhythm of life in winter was defined by this cycle of preservation. Every piece of food that could be saved, every morsel that could be turned into something that would last, was handled with careful deliberation. The women of the village were often at the heart of this process. Their hands, weathered and strong from years of toil, would work tirelessly to ensure that no food was wasted. Fresh vegetables, picked before the first frost, were either dried or pickled to retain their freshness. Root vegetables like carrots, turnips, and potatoes were buried in pits or stored in cellars, the coolness of the earth helping to keep them from spoiling. Herbs, which had been gathered in the early spring and summer, were dried and stored in bundles, ready to be used in stews or as medicine when the harshest days of winter arrived. The men, too, had their role in food preservation. They worked with the salt to preserve meats, beef, pork, and even small game like rabbits and birds, salting them in the large wooden barrels that lined the corners of barns and kitchens. The salt was piled thick on the meat, working its way deep into the flesh to draw out the moisture and prevent decay. The process was painstaking, and the salt used was precious, so much so that it was often only used for the most important tasks. Preserving the meat was a way of ensuring that there would be enough food to last through the harshest months, when fresh food was unavailable, and when the cold made it nearly impossible to gather any crops. Even the simplest task, like brewing ale, had a deep significance. The brewing process, though humble, was essential. Barley, a primary grain used in beer, would be malted and fermented, turning the grain into something more than just food. Ale provided not only nourishment but comfort. Its warmth was a refuge against the bitter cold of the winters, and its alcohol helped to preserve the villagers' sanity during the long, dark nights. Ale was shared among friends and neighbors, helping to foster a sense of camaraderie, a brief respite from the relentless cycle of work and worry. The preservation of food, though, was not without its dangers. Poorly salted or improperly stored, meats could spoil quickly, becoming rancid and unsafe to eat. Sometimes food could be tainted with mold or rot, making it unfit for consumption. In these instances, entire stocks of preserved food could be lost, and the consequences could be devastating. There was no margin for error. A mistake could mean the difference between surviving the winter and going hungry in the face of this uncertainty. There was a quiet determination among the villagers to make do with what they had. Even when food was running low, they continued to stretch their meager supplies as far as possible. The stockpiled food would be rationed, carefully portioned out, each meal calculated to ensure that the villagers would make it through until spring. Dried meat might be boiled with roots to make a simple stew, or stale bread might be soaked in water and served as a base for a soup. Every scrap was used. The bones of animals were boiled to extract the last bit of nourishment, creating a fin. Broth fat could be eaten with whatever vegetables remained. The idea of wasting anything at all was unthinkable. Every morsel of food had to be accounted for, and every effort was made to keep the body fed and strong. Meanwhile, as the peasants fought against the cold, the nobility's food preservation practices were far more luxurious. The noble kitchens were stocked with the finest ingredients, meats cured with the best salt, and fruits preserved in sugar and honey. Spices, too, were stored in abundance, imported from distant lands. These were not just practical methods of preservation, but a testament to the wealth of the lords. While peasants worked tirelessly to keep their stores from spoiling, the rich simply had access to what they needed whenever they wished. Their cellars were stocked with wine, and their larders with delicacies that would have been unimaginable to the villagers. The disparity was staggering. While the peasants relied on resourcefulness and ingenuity, the nobles relied on their vast wealth and access to far-off trade routes. For the peasants, Food preservation was a matter of survival. Every jar of pickled vegetables, every salted cut of meat, every loaf of bread baked and saved was a victory, a small win in the battle against hunger and scarcity. As winter deepened and the days grew shorter, the villagers huddled around the fire, sharing the fruits of their labor. Though the food was simple and sometimes lacking in variety, there was a quiet pride in knowing that they had made it through another season. The food, in its simplicity and scarcity, was a reminder of their resilience. It was a testament to the strength of the human spirit, of the ability to endure, to make do, and to survive as the long days of winter stretched on. The villagers relied on their ingenuity and hard-won skills to make do with what little food they had left. The cold of winter was a constant presence, seeping into the bones of the village and chilling the air that hung heavy over the land. The fields, now covered in a thick layer of snow, lay silent and still, the promise of next seasons. Harvest a distant thought. The earth, once full of life and growth, had gone dormant, leaving the villagers with little more than the fruits of their labor from the fall. What was stored in the barns and cellars would have to last. But there was no room for waste, no margin for error. The villagers had spent long hours preparing for this moment, drying meat, preserving vegetables, and baking bread. But as the winter days wore on, even their best efforts began to feel insufficient. Inside their cottages, the villagers huddled around the hearths, their faces flushed with the heat from the fire. The warmth was a welcome contrast to the bitter cold outside, but it did little to mask the gnawing hunger that crept into the stomachs of those who could not afford enough food. The firelight flickered in the dimly lit rooms, casting long shadows that danced across the walls as the village settled into its nightly routine. Despite the warmth of the fire, the food on the table remained humble thin stews, dry bread, and the occasional salted meat, all eaten in quiet reverence. There were no festive meals, no indulgent dishes to savor. Every bite was a reminder of the effort it took to stretch the food that was left. The peasants knew that their survival depended on careful rationing. Each portion of food was weighed with great care, as they did their best to ensure that their stores would last until the first signs of spring. The bread, though hard and dry, was broken into small pieces and dipped in broth. The vegetables, pickled or dried months ago, were rehydrated and turned into simple stews. When meat was available, it was eaten sparingly, only a small amount added to the pot to provide some flavor to the otherwise bland dish. Even the smallest scraps of food were saved and used, nothing discarded, nothing wasted. Every bit of food that had been carefully preserved or gathered during the harvest was seen as a treasure, to be cherished and rationed. The winter months were harsh for the peasants, but they were accustomed to the struggle. They had learned to make the best of what they had. The long nights were filled with work mending clothes, repairing tools, and preparing for the next planting season. The village, though small, was a hive of activity even in the dead of winter. The rhythm of life continued, slow and steady, as the villagers carried out their duties, knowing that there was little to be done until the warmer days arrived. The earth had gone to sleep, but the people had not. They continued to work, to care for the animals that survived through the winter, and to tend to the needs of the village. The men who had been busy with the harvest now focused their efforts on the repairs that were necessary to prepare for the next planting season. The tools that had been used so vigorously in the summer were now sharpened, cleaned, and stored away, ready for use once the thaw arrived. The barns, filled with the last of the hay and straw, were checked to ensure that the food for the animals would last. The livestock, though fewer in number, still required care and attention. Every action, no matter how small, was part of the larger rhythm of survival. The village's future depended on this careful preparation, on the knowledge that, though the cold would last for months, the earth would one day warm again, and the cycle of planting would begin anew. The women, meanwhile, continued their work of preservation and preparation, ensuring that nothing was wasted. The dried meats were ground into small pieces and mixed with grains to make a hearty porridge. The pickled vegetables, though no longer fresh, were used in soups, and even the last of the hard cheese was rationed out, carefully sliced and served as a small but important addition to the meal. They would sew, mend clothes, and patch the tools needed for the coming months. It was hard work, but it was work they knew well. The rhythm of life in the village, though slow, was unbroken. The food, though sparse, was enough to keep them going as the days passed and the snow continued to fall. There was a quiet, unspoken understanding among the villagers. They knew that spring was still far away, but they also knew that they would make it through. The food they had worked so hard to preserve, though meager, would be enough. The shared experience of scarcity had drawn them closer together. The families gathered by the fire, sharing stories of past seasons, of hardships overcome, and of the promise of spring that would one day return at night as the fire burned low. The village was enveloped in a stillness that seemed to carry with it the weight of history. The peasants, though they had little, were not defeated. The food, though scarce, was enough to keep them alive, and in this moment, in the quiet peace of the village, there was an unspoken understanding that survival wasn't about luxury or abundance. It was about endurance. It was about the steady rhythm of life that continued year after year, despite the hardships. The villagers had survived the harshest winters, and they would survive this one too. Their perseverance, their connection to the land, and their shared strength were their greatest resources. And so, as the firelight flickered and the village settled into its peaceful silence, there was a quiet knowing. The harshness of winter would end, and the spring would come. It always did. The cycle of life would continue, steady and sure, just as it always had. The earth would awaken, the plants would grow, and the food would return. And the village, bound together by their struggle, would rise once more to meet the new season. Though the winter days stretched long and the cold became ever more biting, the villagers' resilience was unwavering. With each passing day, the village sank deeper into the rhythm of winter. The land lay beneath a thick, icy blanket, the trees bare and stark against the sky, their branches twisted like gnarled fingers. The once bustling fields were now desolate, silent in their sleep. The harsh winds howled through the village, shaking the houses and sending the smoke from the chimneys swirling into the air. The villagers, bundled in layers of wool and fur, braved the cold as they went about their work, their faces flushed from the bitter winds. Yet, despite the harshness of the season, there was a quiet determination in their steps, a collective, understanding that they would make it through, just as they always had. Inside the cottages, the fire crackled steadily in the hearth, providing warmth and light in the otherwise dark and cold room. The flames were a welcome sight, offering comfort to the villagers who huddled close to their homes, grateful for the small sanctuary they had created against the cold. The simple meals, though repetitive and lacking in variety, brought a sense of contentment. Every scrap of food that had been preserved was utilized carefully, stretched across the days, the last of the stored vegetables added to the hearty stews. The firelight reflected off the faces of the villagers as they sat together around the table, sharing what little they had. There was no grandeur, no excess, just the warmth of shared labor and the quiet joy of knowing that they would survive. The meal, though simple, was nourishing. The bread, though stale and tough, was dipped in the broth made from boiled roots and herbs, offering just enough sustenance to fill the stomachs of the family. Occasionally, a small piece of salted meat would be added to the stew, though it was rare. The cold air outside meant that every bit of food had to be rationed with care. Even the dried fruits, once a luxury, were now only a small treat, a welcome sweetness in a world that had little. The villagers took pride in their ability to make do with what little they had. They were no strangers to hardship, and it had become a part of their identity, how they adapted, how they found creative ways to survive. The women continued their work by the hearth, tending to the fire and spinning wool for new garments. They sewed the worn and tattered clothes, patching them with care, knowing that every thread mattered. With each stitch, they held the village together, ensuring that the garments would last for the coming months. The simple act of mending was not just about clothing, it was a symbol of the careful attention to detail that ensured their survival. The men, meanwhile, repaired the tools that would soon be needed for the planting season. The labor was not glamorous, but it was vital, ensuring that when the thaw came, the village would be ready to begin the work of spring. As night fell, the village grew quieter. The children, their energy depleted from the long hours of play in. The snow gathered around the fire, curling up under thick woolen blankets, their eyes heavy with sleep. They had grown accustomed to the quiet of winter, and though their imaginations still wandered, the cold air kept them close to the warmth of the hearth. Their dreams were simple, of green fields and bright flowers, of fresh bread and sweet fruits. For now, that was all they could hope for: the return of the spring, the return of food in abundance, and the return of life to the land. In the silence of the night, the village seemed to exhale. The wind outside howled, but within the walls of each cottage there was warmth, there was light, and there was a quiet, steadfast hope. Despite the hardships, despite the hunger that still clawed at the edges of their lives, the villagers found solace in each other. Their community forged through the shared struggles of survival was the anchor that held them firm. They knew the harshness of the seasons, the unpredictability of the land, and the fragility of their existence, but they also knew the strength that came from perseverance, from unity, from the knowledge that they would continue to work, to endure, and to survive. The nights were long, but they were not filled with despair. Instead, they were filled with the quiet resilience, the quiet hum of life continuing. The villagers, nestled close to the warmth of the fire, slept soundly, knowing that tomorrow they would rise and do it all over again. The land, though dormant, was not dead. The rhythms of nature, though slowed by winter's grasp, would return in time, bringing with them the hope of renewal, the promise of spring, and the return of abundance. And so the quiet rhythm of winter continued. The fire flickered low, casting a warm glow across the room, the last embers fading slowly into the night. In the stillness, there was peace. The world outside might have been cold and unforgiving, but inside the village, there was warmth. The people rested not because they had everything they needed, but because they had enough, and in this there was a quiet kind of strength. Tomorrow would come, and with it the work would begin again. But for now, there was rest. There was the certainty of survival, the knowledge that, despite the cold, the work of life would continue. And so they slept, content in the knowledge that they were once again enduring. As winter stretched on, the days grew colder, and the villagers huddled together, their survival now a shared responsibility that bound them more closely than ever before. The landscape outside the village was now nearly unrecognizable. Where green fields had once flourished, there was only the blank whiteness of snow. The cold had woven itself into the very fabric of the village, seeping through the walls of the cottages and settling deep in the bones of the villagers. The fires inside the homes burned day and night, their warmth a constant companion against the biting frost outside. The hearth, now more important than ever, was the center of life, offering not just heat, but a space for stories, for work, and for a semblance of comfort amidst the harshness. Yet even as the cold took its toll, there was a quiet strength that ran through the village. The work of survival never truly ceased, even when the outside world seemed frozen in time. The women continued to prepare meals with what little they had left in broths, stale bread soft in water, and the last of the dried meats. The stew, made from the simplest of ingredients, was a humble comfort, bringing a warmth to the soul, even if it didn't quite fill the stomach as it once might have. The fire in the hearth was never allowed to die down completely, as long as there was wood to burn, for the warmth it provided was not just physical, it was the heart of the home. The men worked steadily, too, though their tasks were less immediately obvious. Much of their effort went into ensuring that the villagers would be ready when spring came. Their tools were cleaned, sharpened, and stored with great care. The last remnants of the harvest had been carefully measured out and stored in the barns, preserving what could still be kept for the coming months. Their work might have seemed unremarkable, but it was vital, ensuring that when the thaw came, they would have the means to start again. Even in the dead of winter, there was always the quiet knowledge that the seasons would change. The earth would awaken and the work would begin anew. Children, for the most part, were kept inside, safe from the cold but restless with energy. They clustered around the fire, playing with scraps of cloth, creating little worlds from their imaginations. They listened intently as their elders shared stories of seasons past, of the hardships that had been overcome, and the triumphs that had come with the harvests. They dreamed of the warmth of the coming spring, when the earth would wake from its slumber and the fields would once again be filled with life. These stories, though simple, were full of hope. The children had not yet learned the full weight of survival, but they understood the rhythm of life, the cycle of work and rest, of hunger and abundance. They learned it from their parents, from the steady hands that prepared their food, from the deep voices that spoke of the future with a quiet confidence in the evenings. When the work was done and the children had fallen asleep, the adults would gather around the hearth, their faces illuminated by the flickering firelight. There was little talk of anything beyond survival. The village had grown accustomed to the quietude of winter, to the long hours spent by the fire, and to the knowledge that the future was uncertain. Yet there was no fear in the silence. The villagers knew that this too would pass. The warmth of spring would eventually return, and with it, the hope of a good harvest. For now, the work of survival continued in the background, a constant rhythm that defined their existence. As the days passed, the length of the nights began to wane. The snow began to melt, though slowly, the earth beginning to stir beneath its frozen surface. There was no rush to the change, no immediate burst of life, but there was a subtle shift that marked the beginning of something new. The sky began to lighten ever so slightly as the first hints of dawn came earlier and earlier. The earth, though still cold, was slowly waking. And with it, the villagers began to stir as well. The shift was not immediate, and it certainly wasn't without hardship. The food still had to be carefully rationed, the fires still needed to be stoked, and the work was far from over. But there was a sense of relief in knowing that the days were getting longer, that the sun was beginning to warm the earth, even if imperceptibly. The villagers could feel it, this subtle change in the air, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when everything would come alive once again. It was a moment of quiet anticipation, a feeling that settled over the village like a soft blanket. Spring would come, it always did, and with it would come the renewal of life. The return of abundance. For now, however, there was peace in this. Waiting, the work had been done, the food carefully preserved, and the winter, though difficult, had not broken them. They had made it through, together, and as they settled in for another quiet night, the soft crackling of the fire and the quiet breathing of the children filled the room. The village was small, but in this moment, it felt like the center of the world, an unbroken community bound together by resilience, by hope, and by the quiet certainty that, no matter the hardships, the seasons would continue to turn. The fire burned low, the embers casting a gentle glow as the night deepened, and in that peaceful silence, the village rested. Tomorrow, the work would begin again, but for now, there was rest. And in that rest, there was the knowledge that life, though it could be hard, would always return. The earth would wake, and the cycle would begin again, as the final remnants of winter began to dissolve beneath the warming touch of spring. The village felt the subtle stirrings of renewal. The first faint breath of spring seeped into the village, its cool air carrying with it the promise of life returning to the land. The snow that had once blanketed the earth had begun to recede, slowly revealing the dark soil underneath soil that had lain dormant through the cold months, now waking once more. The trees, though still bare, began to show the smallest signs of life, tiny buds pushing through the rough bark, promising new leaves in the coming weeks. There was a feeling of quiet excitement, as if the village itself was holding its breath, waiting for the earth to fully awaken. The days grew longer, and the sun's warmth, though still gentle, began to stretch across the village with increasing power. It was the kind of warmth that soaked deep into the bones, the kind that told the body the cold days were finally behind them. The first signs of spring were small but unmistakable. The scent of wet earth, the distant hum of insects, and the soft rustling of the wind as it whispered through the thinning branches of the trees. The world felt full of potential, as if the earth was preparing to offer up its bounty once again after the long, harsh months of winter. The villagers, too, felt the shift. The firewood that had been carefully stocked through the winter months now seemed like an unnecessary burden. The hearths, which had been stoked day and night, now sat quietly, their warmth still comforting, but no longer needed to fend off the chill. The heavy coats that had been worn throughout the cold months were set aside, and the villagers, once huddled together in layers of wool, began to shed them in favor of lighter clothing. There was a lightness to their movements now, a sense of relief in the air. Though the work would continue, the energy of the village had shifted, moving from the heavy labor of survival to the hopeful anticipation of the growing season. The men returned to the fields, their hands already familiar with the soil. The long months of preparation had passed, and now it was time to begin the work that would ensure another year of survival. The tools, once stored away for the winter, were pulled from their corners, cleaned and sharpened. The soil was tilled, turned over once again, the first seeds of the season ready to be planted. There was a quiet determination in their movements. These men knew that the work of planting could not be rushed, that the earth would give only when it was ready. Each seed planted was an act of faith, a belief that the earth would awaken and yield its bounty just as it had done for countless generations. The women, too, returned to their work. The food that had been preserved during the winter months was now being carefully rationed, stretched as far as it could go, to make it last until the first fresh vegetables could be harvested. The bread that had once been so hard and dry now, soft and enjoyed as a treat, was no longer the cornerstone of their meals. The women worked together, their hands moving skillfully as they prepared the first meals made from fresh herbs, spring greens, and vegetables. There was an air of celebration in these meals, small as they were. The first taste of spring was always the sweetest, even if it was just a few leaves of wild greens or the first tender roots to emerge from the soil dot as the village worked together. There was a renewed sense of unity. The cold and hunger of winter had tested them, but the arrival of spring brought a shared understanding of the hard work that lay ahead. The future was not guaranteed, but it was full of potential. The work of the fields, the tending of animals, and the planting of crops were essential to the village's survival. But now, with the arrival of spring, there was a sense of possibility that had been absent through the harsh winter. Life was returning to the land, and with it, the knowledge that, despite the hardships, the cycle would continue. The rhythms of nature, though slow and unhurried, always move forward. As the evening settled over the village, the first stars began to appear in the sky, their pale light casting a soft glow over the land. The work for the day was done, but the night felt different now. There was no longer a sense of urgency, no longer the overwhelming weight of survival pressing down on them. Instead, there was a quiet peace in knowing that the earth was beginning to give back, that the long winter was finally over. The fire still burned in the hearths, and the villagers sat together, their faces warmed by the glow of the flames. They talked not of the hardships they had faced, but of the seasons to come, of the work still ahead, and of the shared hope that the harvest would be bountiful. There was no grand feast, no lavish celebration, but there was something deeply satisfying in knowing that they had survived, that the earth was stirring, and that the future, though uncertain, held the promise of renewal. As the fire burned low, and the village settled into the quiet rhythm of the evening, you take a deep breath, feeling the peace that has settled over the land. The earth, though still cold, is beginning to warm, and the cycles of life are moving forward once again. In this quiet moment, there is the understanding that though the seasons will continue to bring challenges, there is also the certainty of renewal. The earth will wake, the work will continue, and the village will endure. In the quiet embrace of the night, there is the simple, comforting knowledge that life continues. The seasons turn, the land gives, and the cycle of life, once again, begins anew. As the final days of winter receded, and the warmth of spring took hold, the village settled into the rhythm of life once again, more confident than before. The first tender shoots of green began to break through the earth, heralding the return of growth and life. The land, though still cool and damp, was waking up from its long winter sleep. The air, no longer biting, carried with it the promise of new beginnings. The sun rose higher in the sky each day, casting longer, warmer rays over the village. The rhythm of the seasons, ever predictable, seemed to soothe the hearts of the villagers, offering a sense of assurance that, no matter how harsh the winter, life would always return. The work of the fields continued, but now it was full of promise. The men, once burdened with the heavy labor of winter survival, now walked with a sense of purpose, planting seeds into the fertile soil. They moved with a steadiness born from years of experience, knowing that the earth would yield its bounty. In due time, the women too resumed their work, now turning their attention to the new harvest, planting herbs, sowing the seeds of vegetables, and tending to the gardens that would sustain them for the months ahead. The village was alive with the quiet energy of spring. Though the work was hard, it was a different kind of labor. It was the labor of renewal, of hope for a future beyond the struggles of the past. The children, their laughter now a regular soundtrack of the day, ran through the fields, their small hands gathering the first wildflowers of the season. They were unaware of the depth of the struggle that had come before, but in their innocence they represented the renewal of life itself. Their energy, their joy, was a testament to the resilience of the village. Their future would be shaped by the work done now, just as the villagers' lives had been shaped by the labor and hardship that came before them. As evening fell, and the firelight flickered in the hearth, The villagers gathered once again to share a simple meal. The food was still humble, still the same root vegetables, preserved meats, and hard bread that had been eaten through the long winter. But there was something different in the air now, a sense of contentment, a quiet pride in knowing that they had survived. The cold of winter was still fresh in their minds, but it had lost its grip. The warmth of the hearth, the food that was slowly being replenished, and the company of their families filled the room with a sense of peace. The fire crackled softly, and the steady murmur of voices filled the air, offering a sense of normalcy that had been missing during the darkest months. The stars above were now brighter, the nights clearer, as if the heavens, too, were participating in the quiet celebration of renewal. The moon rose high, casting its soft silver light over the village and the villagers. Though they had worked long into the day, rested easier now. The harvest was still a long way off, and there was much work left to do, but for now they were content. The cycles of life had continued, as they always had, and there was peace in knowing that the earth would not forget them, that the land would continue to provide, and that the work they did today would be rewarded in time. As you sit by the fire, the warmth of the flames offering a quiet comfort, you reflect on the seasons that have come and gone. The rhythm of life, so steady and sure, has carried you through the hardest days, and as the earth slowly comes back to life, so too do the spirits of the people. The earth, with its cycles of growth and decay, is both a reminder of nature's power and a symbol of resilience. The past hardships are not forgotten, but they are woven into the fabric of the present. Each struggle a lesson learned, each victory a triumph of endurance. The work of tomorrow will come, as it always does. But for now, there's rest. There's the quiet comfort of knowing that life will continue, the land will awaken, and the seasons will turn once again. The food may still be humble, the work still hard, but there is a deep peace in the understanding that through it all, the village endures. The cycle of life, with all its hardships and blessings, continues, ever steady, ever sure, and as the night falls deeper, the fire burns low and the village settles into a peaceful sleep. There is a final understanding that the earth, though it may rest, will always return, just as the villagers do with the dawn of each new day. The cycle is unbroken, and so life goes on with that thought. You two drift into the quiet of the night, knowing that the future, though uncertain, holds the promise of renewal, and that through the work, the love, and the care shared in the village, life will continue, ever steady, ever sure.